so much misinformation. They're coming from the media. It's about buyer's agency. There's a lot of room for miscommunication and manipulation because this is new and consumers aren't even really sure what to believe. So let's clear some things up. I'm covering what has been put into place due to the settlement with the National Association of Realtors. Then we're going to talk about some of the potential issues that can most affect you. Even now, going on 3 months after the new rules were implemented, we have had changes made already. I have no doubt the industry changes will bring innovation to this market. It has been widely reported that listing agreements and buyer's agency compensation have historically been dictated by NAR or by realtors, and now that these things are negotiable, and that just is a complete lie. I'm always amazed where reporters choose to scare rather than inform and teach consumers. The compensation percentages and who pays what have been negotiated for decades. Yes, both buyers and sellers have always had the freedom to negotiate contracts and also have had the freedom to forego representation entirely and represent themselves. So what has actually changed? There are 2 big changes that went into effect in August in the real estate world. First, real estate agents can no longer show a home without having a buyer agency agreement of some kind, signed by a potential buyer wanting to see the home. I kind of like this change, but I've been using it for years. There are a couple of options to it. Buyers can either sign a single showing agreement or buyers can sign an agency contract. This is a contract that has an extended length of time and is used for the duration of the time you work with that agent. The single showing agreement is helpful if you are a new buyer and are looking for the right agent. I have used this for years also. The difference now is that one of these options must be signed before the first showing. I believe loyalty and duty go both ways. If I'm pledging loyalty and fiduciary duty to a buyer, I expect the same loyalty in return, and this agency agreement helps assure that. Now we sit down with buyers like we do with sellers and explain everything, not just run out and show a home because someone wants to see the home immediately. Now, buyers will need an agency relationship with an agent to see a home. Michigan has had buyer agency in place for about 30 years, and it's the way that I've done business for almost 2 decades. The buyer's agency agreement provides transparency and some clarity in what an agent will do for a buyer, how much that agent will be paid, and how they're going to be paid when the buyer purchases a house. And all of these things will be discussed when we sit down and talk. The second big change is listing agents are no longer allowed to put the compensation amounts on the multiple listings service. It's important to note that all listings in a brokerage are the property of the broker. Your listing agent is an agent for that broker. Your listing does not belong to that listing agent, and therefore the compensation agreement is with that broker, not the listing agent. The broker will then compensate the listing agent. The multiple listing service is the entity that pushes listings out to other agents, buyers, and thousands of internet sites to market the property. But this may be the biggest potential problem in all of this. The changes require that a call be made to the listing agent to ask if compensation is being offered, especially if your buyer can't pay for compensation themselves. Every listing agent will need to be called so the buyer's agent can ask if compensation is offered by the seller. Showing requests will need to be made early enough in the day to get the showing scheduled and confirmed. Now let's talk about what hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is that buyer's agents get paid. Yes, they get paid. They never worked for free. One of the industry norms I spoke about earlier is that buyer's agents' fees were paid out of the proceeds of the sale price. I know what they were actually saying was that the seller was offering compensation of an agreed amount and the buyer's agent was being paid that amount. I feel certain the intention was that the buyer was not paying anything out of pocket. I'm also quite certain that no buyer was ever dumb enough to think that a buyer's agent worked for free. But this is one of the reasons for the lawsuit. I have been an agent and associate broker for almost 20 years, and I have never said that I worked for free for a buyer. But we practice buyer agency here in Michigan, and now things can't be implied for catchy marketing purposes. Other states who now practice buyer agency too because of the lawsuit aren't saying those things anymore because they caused a lot of confusion. Also, I know this is a very difficult notion for sellers to hear, but The buyers bring all the money to the sale. Without a qualified buyer, a seller can't sell their home. So the buyers are and have been paying the compensation. And in fact, they've been paying both sides of the compensation, both listing and buyer side. But it's the seller who sees the sale price and thinks, it's my profit. Then they see the commission coming out before they get their proceeds. So now they feel like they're paying for it. How quickly it is forgotten that the buyer just gave the seller a great offer on their home. They are sometimes paying more than asking and even more than the seller ever expected to get for that property. This is why the sellers would take fees out of the proceeds. Buyers pay all the money in the transaction. Where is that buyer going to get more money to pay their agent? If the seller is not going to pay buyer agency, the buyer will want to take it off the sale price. Having worked as a buyer agent, I know by closing day, the buyer's agent has put in an average of 50 to 100 hours with that buyer to get that seller that perfect sale price. Buyer and listing agents average 100 to 180 different things that they do for their clients on each side of the transaction to get it to the closing table. Issues arise and they are handled. Unless a decision needs to be made by the buyer or seller, lots of times they don't even know that there was an issue. I always tell my clients that they make all the decisions, but it's my job to manage those decisions and make it look easy and seem smooth. When I was a full-time buyer's agent, I would spend entire weekends showing homes. I showed as many as 3 different sets of buyer clients and a total of maybe 15 to 18 houses during that day, on both Saturday and Sunday, and lots of other showings throughout the week. A lot of time and energy and money went into helping those 60 to 100 buyers purchase a home every single year. Now, listing agents pay out of pocket for professional photos, drone photography, Matterport photography, 3D layouts, walkthrough videos, and those pretty glossy booklets that are sometimes left in listed homes. Also, listing agents pay for printings and mailings for open houses and all kinds of advertising to get as many people as possible to look at that house, as well as compensating a showing agent just to do the open house for them. If a house doesn't sell, the buyer's agent and the listing agent don't send a bill for all the billable hours spent and the things the agents paid for out of pocket like an attorney would. It may come down to that at some point, but right now it's not an a la carte menu. Agents see this as a cost of doing business. And in my opinion, this is also the way the seller should think of compensating a buyer's agent. Without a buyer who is giving you money in exchange for your lovely home, the seller would not be able to move forward into the new chapter of their life. Buyer agency compensation is the cost of doing business, and it is still a negotiable cost. I believe this whole lawsuit was based on omissions and misunderstandings like these. I have a whole video that you can watch that explains buyer agency prior to the settlement and some of the consequences since. It explains that not all states adopted buyer agency in 1994 like Michigan did. For those agents in those states, this settlement brings a lot bigger changes than for agents in Michigan who have been doing this for years. So what are the potential issues for sellers? I believe that number one is pricing your home, and it just got a lot more complicated. Prior to the settlement, it seemed to make the most sense to keep the commission percentages on the MLS because it brought consistency for comparing house prices. Now, when your agent is doing a price comparison, no one has any idea if the sale included compensation or not. Not every seller offers 3%, but anyone could go back and see what it sold for, what the compensation was, as well as if there were any concessions given and what type of loan it was. Now, we don't know, so it makes pricing based on comparison to other sales very difficult. Increased costs for sellers as well as buyers. Buyers may need to offer less for the home to account for their additional expenses for agent compensation, or they could ask for concessions from the seller to be put towards the compensation at closing. This could also cause possible appraisal issues. For sellers, this could mean a lower net proceed and more challenging negotiations to arrive at a mutually agreeable price. With buyer costs on the rise, sellers might find that negotiations become more difficult. The buyer may seek compensation from the sellers to offset their agent fees and requesting more repairs or price reductions, as well as the concessions. It can slow down the transaction, and sellers may need to anticipate longer and possibly more complex negotiations. And this could also impact the buyer's perception of the fairness of the transaction. They may begin to feel like they're giving up a lot, and another home that is offering compensation may just be a better option. In situations where transparency is limited, buyers may feel more hesitant, leading to lower offers and drawn-out negotiations. Dual agency conflicts of interest. In dual agency, a single agent represents both the buyer and the seller in the transaction. While Michigan allows dual agency, and it may seem convenient, it can limit the representation and advocacy an agent can provide for each party. For sellers, dual agency situations might mean their agent is unable to push for the highest possible price or the strongest terms, as they are also representing the buyer's increased legal liability. And this is a big one. The new buyer agency rules introduced an added layer of legal and financial complexity, which sellers may not be accustomed to navigating. Sellers and their agents now will need to be particularly careful about disclosures, documentation, and specifics of the agency agreement to avoid liability. We are in a very litigious society. Sellers could face more misunderstandings about who is responsible for certain costs. The legal implications can cause extra stress and added paperwork. These challenges may feel really overwhelming, but working with a well-informed agent can help sellers mitigate these issues and adjust their strategy based on the specific market conditions. My greatest fear in all of this is that the new rules will greatly impact the lower income bracket. It may force buyers to either represent themselves, go to a discount service where they're not fully benefit, or put themselves into a dual agency situation, and none of these are ideal. I believe this would lead to people being taken advantage of, or less ability for home ownership in general, and eventually more lawsuits, including fair housing lawsuits. And let me just say, this is a lawsuit that you do not want to be involved in. Unlike most court cases where the aggrieved party needs to prove that they were somehow treated unfairly, fair housing puts the burden on the defendant to prove that they didn't commit a fair housing violation. In other words, you are guilty until you're proven innocent, and this is pretty scary stuff. Not having buyer agency used to be the norm, and there's a reason why the changes were made. It's been so long that we have forgotten why sellers started splitting their commissions with buyer's agents back in 1994. There's a lot of unknown, and there are so many potential situations that are not covered in an agreement that you sign. So my best advice is to find an agent that you trust, so that when unforeseen circumstances that are not covered in your contract come up, you can trust they're going to work for you. And also know that this is all going to normalize at some point. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks.